Start. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Amsterdam Women in Tech event. And I'm actually really happy because we are doing it almost after 1.5 years. Because, you know, it's all COVID and all. And it was not possible even from the government side and to manage venue and all. Thanks to KID, actually, we get their venue and sponsorship from Capgemini. So thank you. So today's event is basically about the topics on Salesforce security, identity, and access management. And not going.
Not on?
Technical things.
Okay. Yeah, that works. Yeah.
Okay. So before I start, because it's been a long time, so I want to a little bit give you a hint about what Amsterdam Women in Tech is. We started the group in year 2017. Till now, we had around 18 meetups, and our meetups are actually quite versatile. We have done like a pure coding session where we have taught the women about the basic APACs and LWCs and all, and then also about a specific component like approval process or, you know, a basic configuration part, and sometimes like an add-on to an app exchange product. And sometimes we just meet and do party. Like our first meetup was about actually tea party. So we had the cakes and tea and all. So that also we do. If you have any specific preference, just let me know. Next event will be like that. So if you want to follow us, there is a Salesforce user group. It's called Salesforce Women in Tech. This is the page. And if you want to follow us on Amsterdam Women in Tech. So a little bit about me. I started the group in 2017. Currently, I'm working as Salesforce Solution Architect at Fluido. I have around 10 certification and over 550 Trailhead badges. And these are some of my other initiatives. Like I started a group called Decode SF Certifications, where we teach about all the topics around certification. Then I also teach at the RAD Women. So they teach, they select a member of 10 to 12 people and teach the coding. Then I also give answers on the success community, and I was the marketing champion from Salesforce for the first batch. A little bit about myself. And now the most special part is our star speakers. I'm very happy to have them because both of them are CTA. So, you know, they're rare. They're rare species in Salesforce environment. So that's why Lilith and Mohit, thank you so much for being a speaker at our event. Then what we are waiting for, let's get started.
See my screen, and now I should start presenting. And you can see my screen again in PowerPoint, right?
Yeah, we can.
All right, great. So first of all, thanks so much for having me. Only slightly disappointed that I'm not there in person, especially when I hear talk of cake. So next time, hopefully. The topic I want to present today is your org is not an island. So how I&AM can be a solution for a seamless user experience. So I think there you already get the impression where I want to go. I want to focus more on the, let's say, human aspect of I&AM, which is not always easy to capture. And then I know Mohit has a great presentation on more the other side of it. So I won't try to overlap too much. So maybe a bit about me. I'm also a Trailhead fanatic. I'm at 1,000+ badges right now. Also a certification enthusiast, now 23 times certified. One of those is indeed, as Bhavana mentioned, certified technical architect. I'm also a co-leader for the SIMA group. So if you have any interest in architectural topics, we try to have quite a few different sessions and always kind of taking the architect hat along with it. Salesforce principal architect at Capgemini. So that's where KID and I and Mohit are all collaborating, although I haven't been to that very nice office yet. So it's on my list of things I want to do. And then maybe the most challenging one of all is the amateur zookeeper. I have 2 cats and 2 dogs. And well, yeah, I'm their servant, let's say. try to keep them happy. If you want to reach out, you can always find me on Twitter, LinkedIn. I am always, of course, have also a Trailblazer Me page. But if you want me to respond relatively quickly, usually LinkedIn is your safest bet. Okay, so what do I want to discuss today? Well, I want to talk a bit about the why. Why do we want to go with I&AM? What are the benefits? What is it? I think it's a very appropriate topic to include. Then how can you set it up? What are kind of like the basics? I'm not going to walk you through configuration because I know that there's excellent resources on that already. You also have great trails and stuff. But I want to talk really about the concept because I think that is the most important part for me. That's really what makes it easier to understand and also to use and see why it's valuable. So that's the first how, and then I have the second how, which is a bit more advanced. And then finally, I have some resources. They're not that many because actually there are two key resources that you'll see that I very, very much love, and I think you will as well. All right, so let's start with the why behind I&AM. All right, there we go. So why should I care about I&AM, about identity and access management? So the first of all is the ease of use. Now you'll be like, wait, Lilith, I've seen some of the help documentation. It's not that easy to set up, but that's not the ease of use that I mean. I mean the user friendliness, right? So I was already mentioning, usually Salesforce is not the only system that you have in your system landscape. You usually have a few others as well, and all of them come with their own, form of authentication, right? So you can have the typical non-integrated, let's say, way of working where you have different login credentials for all of them. But that's not very user-friendly, right? So you want to go from one system to another, maybe you click on a link and then poof, all of a sudden you have to log in again. It's not easy for users to work with. So one of the ways to still have different systems in your landscape, but make it a lot easier for them is by setting up this identity and access management solution. And you'll also see that it's a lot more secure. It offers a lot more security. Why? Well, because your users don't have to remember all those different passwords that we were just talking about, or even worse, maybe your users already don't want to remember all these different passwords and they use the same one for all of them. So, all of these are big risks that you can avoid if you just set up this, this solution. In addition, there's a lot of other benefits as well, such as the consistency. You can really just make sure that, for example, you set up certain levels of security policies, for example, that you want to have particular requirements on MFA or whichever you want. And it's consistently applied over all the different tools because they all refer back to your identity provider for login. So again, it's a lot easier to make sure that, yes, everything is set up correctly. Yes, every system adheres to these policies because they're managed from your IDP. And then this already, of course, has some maintenance implications with regard to less of it because you don't have to go into each and every separate system. But what I mean with maintenance is more the user provisioning. So we all know every time there's a new hire, they have to get all these accesses and everything. And do you already have access to this or that system? And oh no, I guess they forgot about that. It's a mess, right? So I think there, if you just have this unified system where everything, all the provisioning is done, every time someone new joins, you set them up correctly there. And from there, it will make sure that actually all the systems that you allow them to have access to based on your settings or in your setup in your identity provider are just, everything else is synced based from what you set up there. So that's one of the very, very nice elements of it. But maybe even nicer is that when someone is, for example, leaving the company, then you can also very easily deprovision them, which again is a big concern because which systems that they have access to again, where did I have to remove them? It's a hassle, and it's also just, can cause a lot of issues if someone who actually has left your company still has access to certain environments. You don't want that. So again, maintenance here, really, really helpful if you centralize it. So that's why you should care about identity and access management. Now that we have that out of the way, let's go to the next thing about what is it, right? Because you'll hear a lot of information, but it's not always clear. So I try to break it down into more manageable concepts. And for me, when it became really clear was when I could finally tell these two apart. So maybe for some of you, this already makes sense. But it took a while for me because I hadn't really set this up that much while I was trying to go for the certification. But actually it does make a lot of sense. So the authentication part is just who are you and how can you prove it? And so the identity from the identity and access management. While for the authorization part, it is, okay, so what can you access and what can you do? The access part. Now, any one of you who has read the Salesforce Architect's Handbook from DJ and Jim, you might have seen already some examples or analogies that they have for it. And I think it's very interesting. For example, if you go to the airport, one of the things that you have to go through is like the passport control, where you have to prove, yes, I really am Lilith, and I have the passport to prove it, and you can check it. And in some cases, it can even go biometric by providing maybe also your fingerprint, right? That is me. I can prove it. Please let me in. That's the first step. Second step is then, okay, so now what can I do? Well, I have a boarding pass that says I need to go to San Francisco. So I can use this to get on the plane to San Francisco. Can I also use it to go to Hawaii? Not likely. So, that is a second layer of what can you really do once you are in. So I hope this makes sense. Again, I'm just trying to provide the basics. I have some resources. Anything you want, you can also ask at the end. So now that we know a bit more, okay, the why, the what, let's talk about the how. So authentication, I'm starting with these two. In the 201 part, I have some other concepts on this as well, but I want to start not too deep immediately. So you likely have heard of SAML already, which is usually the thing that you hear the most when people are talking about single sign-on, right? It's very common in that sense. You have certain terminology that you need to keep in mind. I don't think I need to explain user, but identity provider I already mentioned a bit, and that's the system that will validate that you are who you say you are. That's the one that will authenticate you, right? And then we have the service provider. Now the service provider has something that you really want to use. For example, it has Salesforce and you want to use Salesforce. So, you want to make sure that they give you access to the things you want to access there. And they will rely on the identity provider to make sure that you are who you claim to be. And if that's fine, you can get access. Then you have SAML assertion, SAML response. These are some specific elements in the SAML flow that we'll talk through a bit later. And then the other leg, you have the OpenID Connect. So OpenID Connect is built on OAuth. And this is something that you usually will hear when we're talking more about the social sign-on. So for example, you want to use Google, Facebook, Twitter to log into something. This is leveraging the OpenID Connect. And there you will see some terminology such as, well, again, browser, I don't need to explain, but the relying party, which is relying on the OpenID Connect provider to, validate that you are who you claim to be, that you are authenticated again. So we have usually one system that is kind of asking to the other one, hey, is this person cool? Are they who they say they are? So let's jump into a flow. So maybe first of all, there's two SAML flows that you'll hear about, IDP initiated, SP initiated, and it might be confusing, but it's all really where you start from, right? So in this case, we have a user, they're on their identity provider page because you have some nice identity providers, which maybe have some tiles on them where you can click through to go to the other systems. The other systems in this case would, for example, be Salesforce as your service provider. So let's imagine we have this beautiful page. Let's say it's Okta, for example, or Ping, or whichever identity provider that rings a bell. And you see a button that says Salesforce. So that is the situation that we're now in. We are already logged into the IDP because we can see the nice page. We click on the link to go to a service provider. So it is actually, that's the first step that we see. So what is happening there? Well, your IDP knows that you are logged in. So what they will do is they will create this SAML assertion and send that back. We'll go via your browser and to your service provider. And what it will say is, well, maybe in my terminology, this person is cool, is maybe not what you, is maybe not the clearest, but this person is logged in. They are good to go. You know, you can provide them access. That's basically what this is saying. So you can let them in. They are authenticated. So once you have that, then you can actually see the information that you wanted to see to begin with, right? So whatever you wanted to click, you get that information. Now, I explained it in a quite verbose way, but when you actually do this, you don't really notice this as a user, right? And that's one of the powers of the I&AM is that when you're a user, you just click on this particular button, for example, your Salesforce button on your IDP page, and it just takes you to Salesforce. All the other things happen behind the scenes. And that's the beauty of it. Half of the time, you don't really know that you're going through these steps. Of course, except you follow this session, then you do know. So that's the IDP initiated one. So we're starting from the identity provider. Now we also have the SP initiated. What is happening here is maybe you have a bookmark for your Salesforce, right? You're not going via this page on your IDP. You have a bookmark for Salesforce. You click on that. You're trying to access it, but wait, you're actually not logged into your IDP yet. So what will happen there is Salesforce will see you're not logged in. They will ask your IDP to, you know, get you logged in, which will happen. You'll get the page of your IDP. You will enter your credentials there. And then once that is done, there will be a SAML response sent, which will contain the SAML assertion that we saw before, which will again tell your service provider, let's say Salesforce, it's cool, you know, they can enter. So it's more or less the same system. The only difference is that now, instead of getting the SAML assertion, we get SAML response, which contains SAML assertion as well as a bit of other information. And that's why you are really redirected to the initial thing you try to see within Salesforce. So let's say your bookmark goes to a particular report that you want to view. So what will happen as a user is you will click the bookmark to go to that report. You will be redirected to your identity provider login page because you're not logged in. You will enter your credentials there. You'll say login or submit, and you'll then see the report because the system still remembers that this is what you wanted to see because that information is passed back and forth as well. So again, from a user point of view, it's really quite smooth, and it's even smoother if you're already logged in. In that case, you don't have to log in again, of course, right? In that case, you'll just click on your bookmark. Your IDP will say, yeah, this person is logged in, it's fine. And you'll just immediately see the report. A lot of back and forth going on, but you as a user should not really feel it. And this is the power of, you know, making this, setting this up for your system, making it as painless as possible for your user to go between the different systems that you are using. Okay, I think on SAML we're good. So maybe one final step or final time mentioning that this is the SP initiated one. Why? Well, you're initiating this from your SP because you're trying to access that. Next thing, OpenID Connect. Scary, a lot more arrows. Not really though. So the concept is again quite similar. So what you're trying to do first is you're trying to request something, you're trying to access something. So let's take again the report example. You're clicking a button to go to a Salesforce report, but you're not logged in. Okay, so I'm describing this as if it's the first time that you're going to do this because there are a few additional steps there. So in this case, again, you will get redirected. In this case, you will get redirected to your OpenID Connect provider, wow, sorry, your OIDC provider. So let's say your relying party in this case was Salesforce, where you want to see the report, and your OIDC provider is Google. So you'll see Google. Google will say, hey, please log in. I don't know who you are. You will log into Google, and then one step additional compared to the SAML is you will actually need to consent. You will see, for example, that Salesforce wants to use your maybe your avatar, your profile picture, maybe some personal information from Google, and you will need to consent only the first time that you're okay with this. So once you've done that, that's great. Then it will go back to, sorry, your relying party. And this time we're going to a bit of a OAuth territory, so I'm not going to dive in too deep right now. We'll discuss that later. But either way, everything is fine. The systems between each other agree. This person is okay. They're cool. They're who they say they are. And in the end, you get access to your report. So I did skip a few things. Don't worry. We'll get into those, but those are more in the OAuth domain, and I don't want to confuse you. So what is the thing to keep in mind here? You're authenticating. So you're trying to access something. You need to have a particular system. Either it's your IDP in SAML or it's your OIDC provider in OpenID Connect that will actually say you are who you say you are. Once that is all confirmed, you get access to whatever you were trying to reach out to before your report, for example. All right, so far so good. Let's talk about authorization. So for this, we are using OAuth, an open framework, and it's really used to secure data sharing between applications. I'm really going to view it right now from the user interaction point of view, but it's also, and perhaps even you know, sometimes more frequently used in the systems or the interaction between different systems. So taking that apart, that's OAuth for you. The terminology you can see there. So I'm going to stick to the ones that are going to come back quite soon. So we have the resource server, which is something you want to access, right? You want to get something from that info. You want to get some information from there. Authentication server, again, the one will make sure that they can validate that you have access to this. We have then a few tokens that are interchanged, but let's stick for now to the access token, because once you have the access token, you're good, you're clear. And then finally, don't forget about the consumer key. The consumer key is something, if you set up an app, a connected app in Salesforce, you'll see that there's this string that is created there, and that is kind of telling Salesforce that this is the password. You can trust me. This is the I'm disconnected app. Based on the secret, they can really validate that. So that's, yeah, maybe already a bit too technical. I hope I haven't lost anyone yet. But let's dive into the user agent. I took the user agent first. We have a few different flows. There's different reasons why you use one over the other. We can discuss a bit later, but I want to first just walk you through again what is really happening here. So let me just see for one moment, because my Zoom is blocking part of my slides. Sorry for that. Okay, so, sorry, there we go. So again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to access something, right? Before you can actually do this, there will be an authentication, because you still need to prove who you are. However, the authentication part is not taken up as part of the OAuth in the user agent flow. So either, you know, you're going to log in via, for example, the Salesforce forum, or there's a different type of authentication mechanism, one of the two that I just showed, for example, involved. Either it can be the case, but for a pure OAuth user agent, it doesn't really matter. You'll see later, we have the layered ones, and then everything comes together. But for here, you just need to remember there, of course, is authentication. There will be also authorization. And what is the authorization in this case? So we already heard this happen the first time, this consent thing in the OpenID Connect one, right? So there you are consenting that certain information that your OIDC provider holds is being used by, in my example, Salesforce. So again, here, what you're actually doing is you're saying, okay, this particular, well, it says here client, but usually browser, usually it's client, right? It's a type of app, you could say. They will perform certain actions as you in the system, right? In Salesforce, for example, maybe they will retrieve certain information, for example, right? And to make sure that you know what you're agreeing to, what are the powers that they have, you have these scopes. And these scopes could, for example, be they can access chatter. You have some very broad scopes as well, such as full, which will give you them pretty much access. You have others which maybe are only for the API. So those scopes are the ones that when you are going to approve or consent, you will see a beautiful list of exactly what are you consenting to, what will this system, this client be doing in my name with Salesforce, what will they be accessing, for example, what will they be doing? So that's a consent that you give in this OAuth flow. And then after all that is done, the access token will get back and you can access the resource. So again, as a user, it seems much longer than it actually is, because as a user, you don't really notice half of it. So if you're already logged in, then the authentication doesn't even happen. If you've already consented before, this doesn't happen. So in all those cases, you're actually logged in immediately, and you just see the resource that you just get access to whatever you wanted to get access from, whatever the client is showing you. Maybe it's an app that will, list all your contacts in a nice way, or maybe it will show metadata in a nice way that we as developers, for example, would like. So that is basically what it's doing, is using the APIs, and it's getting the information back from the APIs. Why? Because it has the access token to show, hey, I have the right to see this, and it's still valid. So user agent, good. Web server, similar principles. So you're trying to access something, there's a bit of back and forth, which contains the authentication and authorization, where you're again consenting, and then in the end you get access. Now here there's a bit of a different element to it, because not only you're not immediately going to ask your access token, you're first going to get the auth code, and from that you will then later on get the access token, and that's what you'll use. Difference also, aside from that, is whether or not you are sending your secret, whether you can really, again, whether you want to use this, the web server flow or the user agent, for example. It really depends on whether your system that will be using this flow can really store this client's secret securely. You don't want this to leak. So that's really, really important. Okay, so we've understand there's this thing as authentication, there's this thing as authorization, all good, all fine. But then I already said there's authentication in the user agent as well. So, okay, how does that happen if another, if for example, SAML is involved? Well, you will see that this is the user agent, but instead of just having, let's just maybe go back so you can have a reference point. Maybe just here, instead of just having this user authentication, you see that actually that part is replaced by the part that really leverages the SAML flow, as we saw before. So you're still trying to access something. In this case, or your client as you is trying to access something. Instead of sending you, for example, to the Salesforce login form, right now it's sending you to your IDP. You're doing the same thing again. You're logging in there. And then based on that, the SAML response will come back. You will make sure to approve the scopes if you haven't already. And once all that is done, the client, so the app, for example, right, can actually show you whatever information you were trying to see before. So this is just combining the two. And on the place where you would have the authentication as just a very dumb line of user authentication, you're inserting this SAML flow logic. That's the type of authentication that will be used there. So it seems very tricky, and to be honest, it's quite challenging, mostly because this is something that most of us don't really do that frequently, right? Because this is something that usually it's set up once and hopefully it's set up well. So maybe you need to do a bit of maintenance here and there to just make sure. But overall, this is not something that you set up 100 times, or I haven't at least. So, but I hope that, you know, just walking you through it, seeing what is really happening and how these concepts come back will help in making it more understandable. All right, so that was the 101 part. I can't see the room, but I hope I haven't lost anyone. I hope you haven't run out. So let's go to the slightly more advanced. So there's a different type of authentication that I hadn't mentioned yet, and that's delegated authentication. Why haven't I mentioned it yet? Because it's really not as common as the other ones that you've seen. And the basic mechanism there, or what are the differences somewhat, is you go via the Salesforce form, the login form, you fill in your information there, and that is actually sent then to a particular SOAP endpoint as a SOAP message. So I think if anything you want to keep in mind about this delegated authentication is that that is one of the bigger differences between the two. And the other ones, when it comes to login, you log in via the form of your identity provider or of your OIDC provider. So that's Google, for example, that you'll fill in your Google credentials into, or Okta, right? For delegated authentication, you'll see the Salesforce login form, you enter everything there. So that's a big difference between the two. So what is the flow then like? What is the process like? So again, you enter your information on the Salesforce login page. There, they will check for a certain permission. If that is the case, they will just send this information that you have provided as a SOAP request to a particular endpoint. There, it will validate the user credentials, and it will then just send a message back, yes or no, true or false, is it correct or not? And then based on that, you'll actually be granted access, a session will be initiated. So maybe to give an example, whatever you provide into Salesforce, the form that it takes, you don't necessarily have to think of it as a static password, for example, right? It could be a one-time password as well. And that's one of the strengths of this delegated authentication, is that you can send tomato as a password. Well, you can do it in any case, but either way, it doesn't really matter that much, in the sense that whatever logic that you are setting up on your SOAP endpoint will be able to work with this. So maybe you have different forms of more complex authentication that you want to really keep a tight control over. You know, it's something to consider. But again, it's more advanced than what you'll usually run into. If you have to set up single sign-on, it will very, very likely be SAML or social sign-on OpenID Connect. But still, I thought it was quite neat to know. And for a CTA, for example, review board, it's good to know that it exists, so that you, again, have the full view of possibilities there. Okay, so I mentioned that one of the advantages in having an I&AM is provisioning, but I haven't mentioned anything about provisioning yet. So there are two types of, or two mechanisms of provisioning that I want to talk a bit more about. When you have SAML, one of the things that you can actually do is you can set up just-in-time provisioning, which will mean that the first time that your user tries to access, for example, Salesforce through SAML, they will be created on the fly. So you don't need to create a user in advance. The first time that they go through the SAML flow, they will be created just in time or on the fly. That's the concept there. So it's very powerful. On the other hand, one of the things that I always want to mention on this is that provisioning is one thing, but you have to think about deprovisioning too, right? So you want to make sure that when your user should no longer have access, that they are also deprovisioned, that they lose their access, that in Salesforce, they are deactivated, right? And on that, Jwt doesn't really provide this within the same mechanism. So if you want to set up deprovisioning as well, likely you'll have to use a different mechanism. So in that sense, you want to really assess, does this make sense? Maybe I should use the same mechanism for provisioning, deprovisioning. Again, a lot of your identity providers have tooling for this built in. For example, Okta, they use the REST API to actually create or provision and deprovision users. So it's an option, but one of the advantages of Jwt is that you don't have a license that's just sitting there not being used, because the user will only be created once it's really, really needed. Maybe they never access the system, and then you'll never need to, use a license for them anyway. Of course, we are all about adoption, so we hope that all of our users access the system. So it's, again, I wanted to make sure that this concept was known, but know that the deprovisioning is still something you'll need to take care of. Right. Then with regard to OIDC, there's this registration handler. So really, when you saw that flow, there's something more to it. There's something more happening actually there. So once you're going through the flow, you will be, or Salesforce will be checking whether there's already an OpenID profile, or actually it's a third-party account link to see, does that exist here already? If it does, then you can still get updated profile information. This is all done in your registration handler, which again, I'll come to a bit more, but if you look at those logic, these are basically the questions being asked. And then the next one is, okay, but does your user exist? If it does, then maybe just the OpenID profile for this user will be added, so a third-party account link, or maybe your user itself will be created. So based on that, this is quite a bit of logic, and maybe you want to tackle this in a slightly different way. How do you even identify whether a user exists? Based on what? Based on the email, for example, those kind of logical things you might want to tweak. And that is something that the registration handler will allow you to do, because it's an Apex class. So when you're setting up your Auth provider in Salesforce, you can have one of the template ones created for you. And then from there, you can add any logic that you want. There's definitely quite a few examples that you can find if you want to learn more about how it actually works, what is happening behind the scenes. But this is the concept that I want to share with you. All right. So I hope this was informative. I know I didn't cover the full scope, but if I, if that was possible, let's say in half an hour, 45 minutes, then you wouldn't have this awesome Apex Hours series on identity and access management in Salesforce that actually Lawrence Newcomb has created. So that's the second reference, or the second resource that you see. The first one is actually a website or that he created, where all of these flows, all the ones that you saw in my PowerPoint, are copied from there, because I really, really like his explanation. And as I have a little time left, I wanted to just quickly show you why I think it's such a powerful tool, because it has all these different types of flows. You can see the single sign-on flows, which I basically, to the largest extent, already showed. But you can also dive more into these layered flows, where you have combination, for example, of web server and SAML, or how would you combine user agent with social sign-on. So for me, this is really, when in doubt, of course, if you're really not sure, you can always get an Okta trial account, for example, and you have similar options for Google. So you can always try that as well. But this already really walks you step by step through what's happening. It also even shows what type of callouts are being done, and what type of parameters, let's say, are being sent. So yeah, that's my presentation. So I hope it was useful, and thank you so much for listening to me. So I'll stop sharing so I can see you again. You're still muted, kids, but I'm sure you're complimenting me on a very, very clear and
Yeah, was about to. Right, so thanks, Lilith. We'll now do a short Q&A as well for your session. Let's start with the on-site audience, and then later on switch to the online audience, because it will be very difficult otherwise to switch all the time. So let me enable the second microphone. Okay, so if you have a question in the audience here, please raise your hand and I come to with your microphone. Not all at once. Yeah, we have one in the back. Rens, go ahead. Just talk at the top end.
Like this?
Yeah, like that, yeah.
Okay, so you can hear me, Lilith. We met a while ago for some of the field service project in Belgium, looking for a reference. So hi again.
Oh, hi, Rens.
Yeah, hi.
It's quite tiny.
Everyone is tiny compared to you, kid. You're not the benchmark.
That's also true. Yeah, so I think with a lot of implementations, you would go for a single sign-on using maybe Office 365 or some identity provider to make sure that you can get logged into Salesforce. How is it? How is the setup with having a production environment and sandboxes, and what is the best practices there?
That's a very good question. So, well, the best practice, I think, to be honest, is that you use a single sign-on for those as well. The reason for that being is you don't want people who have been working on particular environments to still have access to them once they leave, right? And it's really difficult. I think we've all been in that situation that you're like, oh no, Ted left, but did he have access to that sandbox? Or maybe even worse, he's the only one who actually had access to that sandbox. So, you know, this is that is the best practice, but we all know it's not always the feasible option either, because it does take a bit of work and configuration. You have to set it up, you have to make sure it works, and you have to also really think about the way that you're setting it up in your identity provider, because maybe you don't want the same profile for these people. I've seen it frequently on sandboxes. Maybe it's fine if they are all powerful, right? A godlike creature, but you don't want that in the production, right? So it really depends. And from my point of view, that's what I would say, but I know the practice is not always the same, and I can not really provide too many details on how would you set this particularly up, because I haven't done it myself yet. So if anyone does, find me, show me how you did it, because I would like to see it too.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, anyone else have a question in the on-site audience?
She was very clear.
Yeah.
Must be for sure. You're not all thinking about the reception after already.
Does anyone online have any questions for Lilith? You can just turn on your microphone and webcam, by the way, if you have. Guess not.
Okay.
Lilith, this is Surendra from India.
Yeah, hi.
Hi, hope you're doing well. So this is a question related to especially authentication or authorization in the mobile apps. So for example, let's take the example of how we log into the Salesforce app. Just wanted to understand the authentication protocol used there. Is it like a user agent flow that takes place usually when we implement authentication and authorization in mobile apps? Because the web server authentication is something little complex, especially on mobile apps. Or
yeah,
what kind of security parameters do we even have to consider for authentication and authorization if we have to take it place through user agent flow apart from the slide that you shared?
Yeah, so there's two things. One, yes, normally you would say for a mobile application, you would rely on the user agent flow. That makes sense, totally. However, do keep in mind, I need to double check, but there's this, if you're using, for example, the mobile SDK, and I think that the Salesforce mobile app is in the same boat on that. There's actually this thing called like a hybrid flow, which is the one that they are using. So I haven't really looked it up too well, but I think it's also on the Sundial one, because it uses a slightly different mechanism. And the reason, I think you already to some extent mentioned that, why is it not the web server flow? Yes, it's more complex, but the biggest thing that usually there is taken into account is this client secret that I mentioned, right? You have to be sure that you can store it securely, which is not always something that as a mobile app you can guarantee. So that's why you would then go for the user agent flow in that case. So I hope that this already provides a bit of an answer. I will write down this hybrid thing that I wanted to look for you, and just reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'll see if I can give it to you.
Sure. Of the subject, right? So there are so many flows, authentication, authorization, be it OAuth or SAML. So without even practicing hands-on, how do we remember these different flows? Is there any tip that you want to suggest to the audience, or how do we remember these different flows and create some mapping journey, which one to choose?
Yeah.
Or
So Salesforce actually has some resources on which one you should use. But in general, I think from the ones that I have in the scope for my presentation, I don't want to overstep, because Mohit will talk about some of the flows as well. So I don't want to, push into his session already. However, definitely for the ones that you've already heard. So mobile applications usually user agent, right? So that makes sense. Username and password is also a flow. I hadn't shown it, but it's quite straightforward and simple. Preferably never, because it's not as secure, but it's very easy to set up. So sometimes it's used during testing, but it's not the most secure. So that one we prefer not to use really as much. And then the web server is the most secure. So if you have a system that can store the client secrets securely, I think that's a very good option, because it's the most secure one. However, I'm talking really about flows where user interaction is needed. So if you're thinking about system to system, then I'm handing it over to Mohit, because his session will deal with those, I believe. So I don't want to overstep on that terrain just yet, but there's specific flows that you would use in that use case as well.
thank you.
Okay, yeah, happy to help. Hope I helped. So
thank you. Yeah, very helpful.
I don't hear it, so I think it might still be muted.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you,
Yeah,
but I
okay.
don't hear the room. And I see that someone has the mic in the room, so I think could you mute it yourself, maybe? It wouldn't be a Zoom call if you didn't,
So
Can you
working
hear
now?
me?
Yeah, now I can.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
So hi Lilith, I am Abbas. So thank you for your presentation. So I have like a little question here. So you explained about user agent flow, okay? And in that we pass response type as code, okay? So which is like internally it uses implicit grant type, correct? And it will return access token in the redirect URL. So are there any other access other than implicit grant type we can use in user agent flow?
So that's a very good question, and I don't have. I'm not sure I can go as deep as you would want to. However, there is this mapping that I can provide you where you have the Salesforce terminology of the flows, user agent, web server, etc., map back to the standard OAuth names, such as the implicit grant, such as the user credentials grant, which is in the username password in Salesforce terms. So there is this mapping that exists. I hope that answers your question.
Right, Mohit, all yours.
All right, thank you. The chit chat is still going on. Okay. All right, guys, time for the next session. So good evening, everybody. Let's look at the authorization side of Salesforce. So I'll, in a while, I'll introduce myself, but the session name is Unraveling the Salesforce Authorization Flows and their use cases. I wanted to use a different name. There are many sessions with demystify, but unraveling is kind of the same synonym for demystify, but just a different name. Lilith did a great job, and she presented the authentication side of Salesforce, authorization and authentication, but we are going to look at authorization, and we are going to start with the basics. There are around 40 slides, lots of content to cover. So I hope it will be useful for you guys, but feel free to ask questions in between or after the session. All right, so quick intro about myself. I'm a Salesforce certified technical architect as well, like Lilith. So we are colleagues here at Capgemini, and I'm the CTO for Salesforce at, sorry, what happened? Sorry. Yeah, okay. All right, we are back. So CTO for Salesforce at the Salesforce COE, Capgemini Netherlands, and principal architect. Few things about me: I'm passionate about travel, so I love to travel across the world whenever I get a chance. Of course, COVID played some spoil sport in the last 2 years, but I think things are now looking up at least. And I'm also passionate about new technologies, not only Salesforce, but these days I'm exploring NFT, for example, and some other stuff. So that's few words about me, and you can reach out to me at LinkedIn. I should be able to respond. Okay, now let's. Okay, cool. So let's look at the agenda. So Lilith also touched upon this. So there will be some overlap, but I think it's good because this is a very difficult topic. And if we kind of deep dive into it again and again, that will really help in kind of demystifying it, which is the purpose of this session. So we are going to cover authentication and authorization. What is the difference from my perspective? So Lilith shared her perspective. Both the perspectives are correct, but it's the approach probably will be different on how I'm going to approach this. Then the Salesforce connected app framework. Why do we need it? Salesforce inbound authorization flows. So now we are going to cover all the authorization flows. Some of the folks were asking, I think, a few questions about the authorization flows. So we are going to deep dive into all the flows. And then also we are going to look at how the inbound authorization works and how the outbound authorization works. There is a difference, guys. So we need to understand that. And then the layered flows. Lilith already touched upon that, but I'm also going to probably deep dive into it a little bit. All right, so what is authentication? So the next few slides are quite visual, I would say. I think it will help if we kind of relate to that. So authentication is, prove your identity, So Lilith has already mentioned, but this is another flavor, where your ego and superego goes to a bar and, the bartender is asking, okay, I'm going to see some ID. So who is going to show the ID, ego or superego? But, anyways, if they're able to show the ID, at least they're authenticated. But if you go to the bar, it doesn't mean that, you are allowed to drink, right? It depends upon, if you're authorized to do so, there could be an age limit or, different criteria. So that's authorization, right? Where the bartender can say, oh, I'm going to deny you, or deny the entry, or I'm going to approve the entry, but you are not able to buy the drink because you are not of a legal age or, different reasons. So that's authorization. So two different things, but many people confuse that, of course, both the things. But then let's deep dive a little bit, right, on authentication and authorization. And let's look at it from a Salesforce word perspective. So authentication, you have seen that on the left, right? How does the user prove his identity to access a Salesforce org? Very basic. Most of you guys work on Salesforce platform, right? How do you log in into your dev sandboxes, right? You use your username and password and log in, right? Very plain and simple. But you can use SAML SP initiated or IDP initiated flow as well, as Lilith covered. So that's the SAML way, where there is an IDP outside and you're going to seamlessly access. So most of you would access your company portal, right? And typically those companies' website, for example, if we access our Capgemini talent website, of course, there are some external folks also, of course, quite a few, but if I access that, typically it's a SAML, right? So delegated authentication, you have already seen. There is something called certificate-based authentication, where a user can use a certificate, upload it, and then can authenticate. I don't think we need to deep dive into it, but there are different mechanisms. When it comes to authorization, how a user is authorized to access data in Salesforce, right? What are the basic building blocks? A user is assigned a profile, right? The moment you log into Salesforce, you have a profile and a permission set. If you are going to access a managed package app like Salesforce CPQ, or any other managed package, there are going to be permission set licenses, right? Then there are sharing mechanisms, right? Most of you would be aware about sharing mechanisms, right? Like, can you see an account record or not? Can you see it but edit it, right? So all different things. So all of these come under the purview of authorization access, right? Like what if the user is able to log into Salesforce, but what the user can do. And then there are different permission set like session-based muting, right? So this all happens within Salesforce when the user logs into the Salesforce, right? But look at the problem statement at the bottom, right? The red problem statement. It says, but what if the user wants to access the Salesforce data or records in the Salesforce org via an external app, right? So you are logged into, so let's say you access a banking app, okay? So you log into your bank's website, and then there is an integration from the bank website to the Salesforce, wherein there is a button called Get My Account Details from Salesforce. You're going to click that button on the website UI, but you are going to get the data from Salesforce. So see the difference here. The user has not even logged into Salesforce, right? User has just logged into an external application, and that application is sending the request on user's behalf to get the data, right? So since the user is logged into an external app, the user is not accessing the Salesforce org directly. So that's point number one. Number two, Salesforce doesn't know which user is trying to access, via API request, unless and until that API request indicates that, this user is requesting the data. The third point, there are no Salesforce specific data sharing controls. So there are thousands of accounts in Salesforce. Which data should be returned by that API and displayed on the website UI? It's not clear. There are no user specific permission set licenses or profiles on the external app website, right? So the point is that everything is outside Salesforce ecosystem. That app is external, but the user wants to access the Salesforce data. So then what should we do, right? So then let's look at another problem statement before we come to the answer, right? So let's look at this scenario. So there is an external app with no authorization, right? So that's the scenario I just really explained, but it's more pictorial, right? So you have a user logs into an external app, clicks on Get Account Details button, and Salesforce say not authorized, because Salesforce doesn't know what's going on, why this app is sending an API call to me and requesting the data. So Salesforce say, no, I will not authorize you. But it's not moving. Okay, so let's look at the solution to this problem. So the solution to this problem is that authorize the external app with authorization 2.0, right? Now, what is Auth 2.0? It's a protocol which stands for open authorization, not open authentication. Okay, so many people say that Auth is authentication, but here we are authorizing an external app to access data from Salesforce. It's an authorization, right? So the standard definition says it's a protocol designed to allow external apps to access resources hosted by other web applications. So external app is this one on the left, Salesforce application is on the right. We are authorizing the external app to access the resources, access the account records which are stored in Salesforce, and in an authorized manner, right? What do we need to do to send an authorized request to Salesforce. That's where the auth access token comes into picture. Lilith also touched upon that, but some more details there. It's every authorization, there is a concept called access token. It's a big key, which should be included in your API header, so that Salesforce recognizes that, okay, this request is coming from this external app in this user context, and I need to provide the data, right? The format of this access token is JSON Web Token, JWT. It's a standard wherein you have a key value pairs of name and their keys, right? We'll explore that. And it comes with an expiration date and time. So it's not like if you got an access token to do something, it will be there forever. There you can, typically there is an expiration date and time. But this is the solution, right? Authorize the app by providing an access token. All right, let's deep dive into two more things about auth, right? What are auth roles, right? So Lilith already covered that, but I'm going to again touch upon that a little bit. What is a client? So client is an external app. So in our example, it's a banking app. It's a banking website. What is a resource server? Resource server is an application which hosts the resources, which hosts the data. In this case, Salesforce, right? Because we are trying to get account data from Salesforce. What is an authorization server? Authorization server is an application which provides access token to the external app, right? On authorization. Now in Salesforce Word, if you look at it, who is, if Salesforce is the authorization resource server, we have already covered that. But what is an authorization server? Where is that in this schema, right? It's Salesforce itself. Most of you guys know login.salesforce.com, that's the authorization server. Okay, so Salesforce acts as authorization server as well as resource server. So when you hit login.salesforce.com, you are hitting the authorization server. And there you log in, let's say with username and password. The moment you log in, and then you are redirected to your home page or your account screen or contacts view. That's the resource server, because now you're looking at the data, right? That's when the user is physically logging in. But when it comes via API also for API request as well, login.salesforce.com is the authorization server. And then any record, which is account record, contact record, which will be returned as part of the API response, that is coming from Salesforce as well, where Salesforce switches the role to resource server. Who is the resource owner? Resource owner is a user, guys, because what are you trying to extract? Your user is trying to get his or her account details from Salesforce. So user owns the account record, right? So typically user is the owner of the data. User wants that data. So typically user acts as the resource owner. So this is the whole schema. So the authorization is all between, working between these roles. Now let's look at a scenario again. So the scenario is that how Salesforce will trust this external app. So let's look at another scenario, right? Or the same scenario. The user logs in into the banking website, and user wants to fetch the, and that banking app needs the user account details. Now the account details are in Salesforce. Now, if an external app sends a request to Salesforce, will the Salesforce agree to send the data? Even if there is an access token or the other things. How Salesforce can trust that this is a genuine app, this app is actually sending the right data to, or I'm supposed to respond to this app. It's like there are many websites. Salesforce is not supposed to return the response to every website, right? There has to be an agreement, right? So there for that, what OAuth in general and in Salesforce Word as well, what we call is client app credentials, right? So this external app has to register with Salesforce first before initiating any communication, and it needs to acquire its credentials, right? So it's very common, or let's kind of look at another scenario, right? Like if you get an access, right? Let's say you register for a event, right? So you registered for this meetup, right? For example, online folks or so. So you have a username and password, right? With which you log in into Salesforce using username and password. So you register that, you get some credentials very first time on the Trailblazer community, and then you use that to register for event. It's very similar. This external app has to communicate with Salesforce, authorize that. So this external app needs to have its own credentials, like we as a user needs that. In authorization word, it's called client ID and client secret. Okay. Also, consumer key and consumer ID. These are the same things, right? So this app needs to have those. Okay. So that's the gist of this slide. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. I think I will forget after 40 slides. So I'm asking now.
Yeah, please.
So I'm confused now.
One sec.
Because the others did not hear your question.
Let me give you a mic. 1 sec.
Yeah. So I'm getting a bit confused in authentication and authorization. So you said that is the whole authorization process, right?
Yeah.
But you cannot go into authorization until and unless you are doing an authentication first, correct?
Right.
So we are right now, are we talking about something like connected apps and the certification? Are we talking about that? So that should be preset before this whole authorization process happens?
So what happens is when you talk about authentication, right? It's a good question. So it's typically, if you look at authentication, an end user logs in into Salesforce physically, right? Or at least the session is created, for that particular user, right? So, for example, if you log in into Salesforce using your username and password, it's one form of authentication, right? Then using SAML, SP initiated or IDP initiated, what happens eventually? Your browser redirects you to the Salesforce org. The user actually interacts with the Salesforce org himself. But now, when it comes to authorization, what's happening is the user is authorizing a third-party application to access its Salesforce data without user physically logging into Salesforce. So, of course, there is going to be an authentication also, which needs to happen. But all these authorization flows, they club the authentication and authorization both in one single flow. And we are going to deep dive into that. But yeah, authentication needs to happen. But there are different ways in which the authentication and authorization works together. Whether the user, if it is going to be SAML, then like Lilith showed, the authentication can be taken care by SAML and authorization can be taken care by web server flow. Or there are other flavors as well. But authentication has to happen before authorization. So that's the concept. So hope it's clear, right?
Yeah. Thank you.
But the only difference is when I say authentication and authorization typically is when a user logs into Salesforce. The end result is that user is available into Salesforce environment, right? Accessing the records directly. However, authorization, when we typically look at authorization, it's like user is not logging into Salesforce directly, but authorizing a third-party app to access its data. For example, if you are accessing Salesforce mobile app, right? It's on your mobile. The mobile app is getting the data from Salesforce server, your Salesforce org. The mobile app is installed on your mobile. Is the user directly logging into the Salesforce server or no? But user is still able to access all the data on Salesforce mobile app because there is a user agent flow, which is enabling that mobile app, authorizing that mobile app to get the data on the user's behalf on the mobile app, right? But there is an authentication still happening, which we will see in a while. All right, so some other basics, guys. Lilith also covered that, but my view on the scopes and grant types, right? What are scopes in Auth 2? So scopes define the type of protected resources that an external app can access, right? So again, going to that bartender example, right? If the bartender allows the ego and superego to go to the bar and enter the bar, the bartender can say, okay, ego, you are allowed to drink only beer. Sorry, I'm taking some names of the alcohol, but just an example, and because it's a bar example. And the superego can drink whiskey, but the ego can drink beer, right? So they have two different scopes, right? Both of them are authorized to access the, the drinks, but in a different way, because they can only choose subset of the drinks available in the bar. That's scope. Very simple. Okay, so it's not that you are authorized, you have full access to the data. In authorization word, scopes control even after the authorization. What is the scope? What is the parameter or the boundary of that scope? So, for example, in case of bar, the beer is one boundary for one person, whiskey is another boundary for another person, right? So in Salesforce, for example, some of the scopes are full API web refresh token, right? So API is that the external app, the banking application or the website. Yes, please.
Sorry, I have a question about
scope. Yeah.
Would you say it's what we talked about before, the permission set and the sharing mechanism, or is that like a different thing?
No, it's a different thing. So permission set and sharing mechanisms comes into picture when the user, like user as you, logs into Salesforce application, and based upon your profile and permission set, you get access to certain objects and their data, right? Then you are directly logging into Salesforce org and control sharing set and profile control that mechanism. But scopes are when an external application like banking application is trying to access Salesforce on your behalf because you are the user of that website and trying to get data from Salesforce, right? So, for example, like I will when I will log into a banking app or any user and click on Get Accounts, the end result of that should be that only your account details, because you are the user of that banking app, only your account details should be brought back, not all the users' account details, right? Because it would be a nightmare. It would be a security failure if you can access all the data, right? So that's where the scope comes into picture, which says, oh, this is the user context. You can only access Salesforce, for example, via API. You cannot really directly log into Salesforce, or you can restrict the scope to web, which means the external application can redirect to Salesforce via browser, but cannot make an API call. Okay, so basically you can control how the external app can interact with your Salesforce to get the data. So API restricts the external app to only send a request the data via API. However, web means that the external app can redirect via browser and and get the data. So there are different ways.
Quick question.
Yes.
You are talking about scope, and then you said beer and whiskey. Right?
Yes.
Are you saying like beer and whiskey are two different objects?
Beer, no.
Access the object, or like
beer and whiskey are two different features or data sets. Okay. Yeah, or let's say features of the platform. And one application, or like Ego, for example, if it's an application, is only authorized to access beer, which can be beer feature, and the other super ego is going to access whiskey feature.
So it means that you still have to use the profile, for example, to control access to.
Yes. The user context always comes into picture from the object perspective, but the scopes are mostly about the features. For example, can your banking app make a REST API call into your Salesforce? Who will decide that? Do you want to restrict it? If you want to restrict it, you need to exclude the API scope from the authorization. And then the external application cannot make an API call.
Okay. Just to avoid the confusion here.
Yeah. No, that's good. Any other questions? No? Okay. All right. So scopes, we are clear, because the scopes are like whether API versus UI versus web, so the different scopes. What about grant types? You have heard about grant types, right? Also. So grant types, many people say, what is a grant type? Authorization code. I was having a discussion with one of my colleagues. He was asking about implicit grant type. What exactly is a grant type? Very simple. Grants are just a set of steps a client app needs to perform to get resource access authorization. Simple. So basically, an external app wants to obtain access to token authorized with Salesforce. What are the steps external apps will follow to do that? There can be many steps. There can be different flavors of that steps, right? And those different flavors are called authorization flows. Simple, So You want to go to Amsterdam. Okay. Again, we are in Netherlands, so let's talk about that. How can you go to Netherlands? Oh, sorry, Amsterdam. What are the different ways? You can go by train. Take a train from Leidschera and go to Utrecht Central. Take a train. If you have a car, you can go directly, A2 highway or whatever. Go by car. Or I don't know. You can bike as well if you want. I don't know if it is practical, but so these are the steps as a user, or let's say end user, you are taking to access Amsterdam, right, or reach there. So similarly, the similar analogy is that there are external apps, and they want to obtain access token from Salesforce to get authorized access to Salesforce. Now they can take different steps. They can choose different paths. Those different paths are basically the different flows or grant types. So grant types are actually the flows. So grant types define the different flows. So some of the commonly used flows are web server, user agent, JWT. We are going to deep dive into that. But you have already seen web server and user agent. But what I wanted to tell you is that why grant type? What is a grant type? What is the mystery? Why we say there are 8 authorization flows in Salesforce? Why are they even there? The reason is that, Authorization Protocol has defined a set of steps which any application can take to get an authorized access to any third-party application. And those are standards, they are standards. So it's not like these flows are only specific to Salesforce. Any application which supports Auth 2.0 protocol, which is a common standard, like WW3 is a web standard, any application which complies with Auth 2.0 has to comply with most of these flows, right? The steps are going to be similar. The naming convention can be different. And Salesforce has implemented that in its own flavor here. But grant types define the different flows. That is what I wanted to say. And what are grant types? Set of steps. Whether you want to go by train, cycle, maybe swim. I don't know. Can we swim? There is a, I don't know. So that can be another set of steps if it is approved. I don't know. All right. So let's move on. So what is a connected app now? So different flavors, grant types, scopes. But where do we define a connected app, and what is a connected app, right? Why do we need connected app? Okay. So why do we create a connected app? So let's look at problem statement number 1. Where should we define the various scopes granted by Salesforce to a specific client web application? Let's look at the banking application. So banking application can only communicate with Salesforce via API post-authorization. But there was another retail website which can communicate with Salesforce via API or via some other flavors, or other scopes, and can access more features. Where should you define that banking app has only API scope, but the other application has some more scopes? There should be a storage somewhere, right? A placeholder. All of us are IT professionals. The data needs to be stored somewhere. Where should we define the grant types? That, okay, banking application can take these set of steps to authorize with Salesforce, but a retail website can take another steps. Again, how can you define that user A will only go to Amsterdam by a train, but user B can take a car and go to Amsterdam? He is authorized to take a taxi and go there. The company approves it, right? So you need to define these things somewhere, right? And that's why, and then third thing, how these apps will get their credentials. We talked about client ID and secret, right? Because these apps needs the external website, banking website has to authenticate, prove its identity to Salesforce. That, okay, I am the app who is authorized, who is approved by you to send authorized calls. So you have client ID and secret. Those needs to be generated. You need to store the scope somewhere. You need to define the grant type somewhere. And that for each individual app. And look at Salesforce, right? In any typical enterprise landscape, or there can be many external application who wants to authorize to Salesforce. So you need to store these parameters per app, in Salesforce. So what then Salesforce came up with something called connected app. So Salesforce said, okay, every app, every external application who wants to integrate with me in an authorized manner will be represented by a connected app in Salesforce, where every connected app will define what is the scope, what is the grant type, and it will also generate the client ID and secret, okay, for that. And then every specific app will get its own client ID and secret, and it will try to authorize with Salesforce based upon the grant type agreed between Salesforce and that particular app. Simple. So it's a placeholder. Now, we have covered the problem number 2 as well, because there are multiple client apps, which means you need to create multiple connected app. Connected app has a one-on-one mapping with any external app which wants to authorize with Salesforce. Okay, so it's a framework. It's just a record. It's a framework which has various sections where you can define. Okay, this connected app has this scope, is allowed to use these scope. This is the grant type. And many other things, policies, custom permissions, and other things. Okay, so this is just a record, right? So typically, if you see in your production orgs, if a big enterprise, there are many connected apps defined. Okay, so for example, the moment you connect your Salesforce mobile app, right, with Salesforce, there is a connected app which is created in the background. Help.salesforce.com. See in your Salesforce org, there will be a connected app for that, representing that, right? So you don't even know, that there is a connected app there. Salesforce CPQ, the moment you authorize Salesforce CPQ, there is a connected app which authorizes with their calculator service, which is SteelBricks, right? So every external app is represented by that. Now, let's look at connected app a little bit more, some advanced stuff, but I just want to go through this very quickly. So connected app doesn't only control the scope, grant type, and other things. It can also ensure that who can access your connected app. For example, it can also enforce IP restrictions, that if the website, the API request is coming from this IP, let's say, for example, talking about US, and some other country, if the US has banned that country any traffic, for example, or so in that case, if a request originates from any IP which is active in that banned country, the connected app, you can define the policies which says, okay, that IP is not, we are not going to allow that request. So IP restrictions can be enforced. You can also define how long a refresh token is valid for. We'll come back to this slide maybe in the end, because then it makes more sense, the refresh token. But what I wanted to show in this is that there are many access policies and other things. So connected app is a big framework. For this certification, you should deep dive into it a lot more. And if you want to become a CTA, then you need to know in and out of it. Then there are some other advanced steps, how you can dynamically change the behavior of connected app. There is an apex way of changing the behavior as well, overriding the connected app behavior or modifying that. I don't want to deep dive into that right now, because I think let's go with the flow, but I will come back to this in a while. All right, let's look at the flow scenarios, guys. So first problem statement. Okay, so I want you guys also to read, but I will also read for you guys. A user logs into a web application and click on Get Account Details button on the website to get the account details. We have already discussed this scenario. Which grant type / Auth 2.0 authorization flow should be used by the web app to authorize with Salesforce and obtain an access token? Simple. Yes. Yes. The solution is there, but thanks for calling that out. All right, so it's a web server flow, all right, with the grant type authorization code. Now, it's easy to say that the solution for this should be web server flow. The question is why? Why web server flow fits the bill here and not any other flow? As an architect, you need to understand, you need to provide solution to the client and say, okay, this is your problem statement, this is web server flow. The client is going to ask a justification, if the client is technically, more mature. So, all right, so this picture actually depicts that, right? User accesses a website on web server sends an authorization request to Salesforce, and Salesforce sends an authorization response. But What you see here is that there are many steps here, right? Like first thing, user logs in at number 1, then web server, user clicks on a button, web server sends a request for authorization, then it gets an authorization response, then it sends an access token request. So there are many steps. Why these steps are there, right? Like we need to be very clear about that. So let's deep dive into this. So again, guys, cloudsundial.com, I think that's the right name. All of us have referred to that. So you should actually check out that website. Lilith has already put that in a reference. I have also put that. So a very clear depiction of the flow. So Lawrence Newcomb, the credit goes to him. So if you look at this, right? So the web server flow, right? Like why a web server is required, right? Here, let's look at this, right? So how do you access your website? How do you access it, right? So you open a laptop, you open a browser, and you log into your banking website with your banking credentials. So the browser on the left is your own browser. The client app server is your banking website. It's a web server, it's running somewhere. You access it with the browser, the client app server, which is the banking app. And then you have the authorization server and resource server. As I mentioned, for Salesforce, authorization server is login.salesforce.com, resource server is Salesforce itself. So both of them are Salesforce here. Lawrence has created that in a more general way, but in Salesforce word, authorization server and resource server are Salesforce. So what will happen is browser will send a request to client app, like get account details button. Client app is configured to get the details from Salesforce. So what client app will do? Client app will via browser. So you can see their redirect URI, which means there is no direct post call happening, but via browser, there is a redirect to authorization server, Salesforce. Now, what will happen is at the authorization endpoint, and then some parameters will be sent. One of the parameter will be client ID. Where is the client ID stored, guys? Anyone? Connected app, right? So there will be a connected app for this banking app. So that client ID will be stored there. Response type indicates to the authorization server that this request is looking for an authorization code. Okay. So authorization server, what it will do? What is authorization server? Login.salesforce.com. So the Salesforce will force the user, because this is a browser redirect, right? So user will be redirected via browser to this app. So user will see this screen there, right? User log in with your username and password. So user will have to log in there. If the user session is not active, user will log in. How many of you have seen this screenshot, allow access? When did you see that? When? Any example?
When you are moving from one website to another.
Yes. So for example, if you log into Workbench the very first time, you basically have to authorize the access to that particular app, and there is a setting in the connected app which actually forces this. So we'll talk about that. But this page comes only once, guys. Very first time. The very first time you're logging via Workbench, logging into the Workbench. What Workbench tries to do? Workbench runs on a separate server. So Workbench tries to access your Salesforce information. And it uses connected app as well. It's a web server flow. So there could be an interview question: which is the flow used by Workbench to authorize with Salesforce? Web server flow. Why? Because it's a website. It's a web server, right? So here it shows also the permissions: access to your basic information, access to your unique identifier, access to your data via the web. Do you know what is this? These 3 points. What controls these 3 points? Because connected app, but what is in the connected app? Scopes. Yes, because the scopes which you will have defined in the connected app, that actually means that if you allow this app to access your Salesforce data, they will get access to all the scopes. Like, for example, your ID, your unique identifier, everything is in the connected app scope. So for example, if you remove the unique identifier scope from your connected app, and next time any new user will try to authorize this app, this second line will not be visible because it's all by the connected app, right? And then the user says, okay, allow the access. So these 2 steps, user authentication and authorization, are happening here. The login part is authentication, and then authorizing the access to the connected app is this, right? So once the user has authorized the access, then authorization server says, okay, this is a right user, valid user. Let me share an authorization code with, and redirect back to the web server, which is your banking app. Now, can anyone tell me, let's make it more interactive, why authorization code is required here in the middle, right? Like, what is an authorization code and why do we need it here? Can anyone, who has worked on this or is aware about it, can tell me?
Is it the 4-digit code, for example? They send you with your email address?
No.
So it's a code so that you can access the data from the authorizing platform.
Yeah. Anyone else?
I thought also something like the MFA, multi-factor authentication, so they are sure that it's to give like access what you asked for.
No. Yes.
We don't have to re-log in every time. We don't have the login fee.
Okay. Anyone else?
Use it for the first document.
Sorry?
To get the actual access to Salesforce, we pass the authorization code as an exchange.
Okay.
When they send the code.
With this code, you just proving that you have access to the data that you requested.
Okay.
I have a question.
All right. I'm listening, guys, because
Where do they send the code to?
so the code is sent back to the web server from where the request is initiated via the browser. So it's in the URL. So if you see this flow, it is in the URL as a URL parameter. Now think about it. Sending a security code in the URL, is it a very secure practice? Have you guys heard about man-in-middle attacks? Security, anyone can, can kind of see what is being redirected into the, in the browser. It's a challenge. So it's not really good. So that's why there are two things which the Auth protocol is, which is the general recommendation. Number one, Auth code is very short-lived, guys. It's just the validity of the authorization code is 2 minutes or even lesser. You can control, I think 1 minute or 2 minutes. I don't remember on top of my head, but it's very, very less, because if a man-in-middle attack happens and someone kinds of captures this authorization code and has already kind of stolen the client credentials, which is ID and all, it's going to be a nightmare, right? Because anyone can then send authorization request to Salesforce, which will be fake. The second thing is, see, there is a web server, right? Like what will happen if instead of the authorization code, like my question to you guys is that why authorization code is required at all? I mean, the user has already authenticated with Salesforce, allowed the access. Why can't the web authorization server, which is Salesforce, directly provide the access token to Salesforce, to the web server, right? So here, there are two steps happening. If you see, there is an authorization code, which is first being provided to the client app. Then the client app takes that authorization code, then makes another request to get the access token. And this is the token then which is used for authorizing your APIs. So there are two steps, right? Why there are two steps? There are two steps, right? Like as a an architect, or you can ask me that, Mohit, why can't this web server directly provide an access token at the very first step? Why the authorization code is required? You are just wasting time by doing this interaction. Yes. Yeah.
Cryptography? Is it like a public key to decrypt the data?
No.
Okay.
So it's okay. It's okay. See, no answer or no argument is a bad argument, guys. We all are learning here. But the point is, okay, in since we need to move fast as well, we all need to go home after this. So authorization code, right? The reason is that there is a client app server, right? So the same question, right? If the Salesforce directly provides an access token to a web server instead of the authorization code in between, then there is a chance that someone in the middle, because the redirection is happening via browser, right? If you look at it, how the initial redirect happened via browser, right? Then the authorization code is also returned in the browser, right? So there is no HTTP post happening here, right? Direct API call happening. So do you guys know the difference between browser redirect and API HTTP post call? Anyone? Browser redirect, very simple, guys. You are all the information is being passed on the browser URL as a parameter, which is very risky, like it is prone to man-in-middle attacks. But if you do an HTTP post, all the information is in the body of your HTTP post request. It's not there on your browser URL. So how will the man-in-middle attack happen? Yeah. Someone saying something? No? Okay, I heard some voice.
So basically, the authorization code is that you get that in the browser.
Yes.
And then you send it to your app.
Yes.
And to tell the app to request the access token.
Using this authorization code.
Because the access token should not be in the browser.
Yes.
But should be saved in the app.
Exactly. That's the point, right? And another thing, why we say authorization code with secret, right? You need to understand that. So the app has received the authorization code. Next time, now the app needs to get access token. So here, there is another parameter included in the request, which is called client secret. Okay. This was not passed on in the first request via redirect, right? So client secret is needs to be very secure. It needs to be kept very secure. And it is only passed during the access token request. And there is a reason why it is, right? Because authorization code is being redirected via browser. So there is a chance that someone can do man-in-middle attack. So any kind of, let's say, how should I say there, false entity, right? Or someone who wants to fake the identity can capture this authorization code and can steal the client ID, because initially the client ID was also passed in the browser, and can send an access token request and retain the token. But the problem is that fake entity or whatever will not have the client secret. The client secret is securely stored in the backend code of the client app server. So that's how the trust is established, because during the access token request, the client app will not have to only send the authorization code, but also send the secret, which only the client app server knows. There is no fake entity, no man-in-middle attack can actually spoof it and do that, right? And with that, you can be pretty sure, Salesforce can be pretty sure that this access token request has come from a genuine entity, not from someone fake who has spoofed on the authorization code and send another request, right? So that's why this.
That HTTP post you don't see in your product.
You don't see that. HTTP post is like out of band post, yeah, in the background, right? So there is no browser thing happening there. So that's the reason why we say that web server flow is only meant for web server app, because web server app, they can securely store the client secret in their backend code.
Access token generated every time the request is made, or only the first time?
Access token, it needs to be obtained one time, then there is a validity of the access token. So once the access token is obtained, then every new request like get account, get contact needs to be authorized by passing the access token in the HTTP post. And once it is expired, then a new access token needs to be, we need to obtain that. And for that, we use refresh token, which is another flow we'll talk about. But this is the very first time, it's like a new app is trying to authorize with Salesforce and obtain an access token. So these are all the steps. Once the access token is retrieved and it is valid for next 24 hours, then every API call, you just need to include this access token in the API header and get the data. Salesforce will trust you.
The access token is valid for 24 hours? Or for
you can define that. You can define that. It's 24 hours, but you can also extend it. I think maximum it's You can define the duration in the auth access policies in connected app.
So you can even put it 1 hour.
Yeah, 1 hour as well. Exactly. So I hope, why the secret thing. Now tell me, guys, if you have a mobile app, right? You have a Salesforce mobile app. Where is the Salesforce mobile app installed? Or your banking app, where is that installed? Mobile app. Mobile, right? Okay. Is that really secure? Because in this case, the web server is running somewhere. The banking, do you have access to this web server backend data? Do you know? Like if you go to ABN AMRO's website, I'm just taking a hypothetical example. Do you know where the ABN AMRO's database is and where the code base is running, whether it's which platform technology they are using? You don't have. So that's why so web server can securely save the client secret, right? There is no way any end user can get, or any malicious entity can get access to client secret. But let's look at mobile app. Let's say if there is a mobile app is installed on your device, right? There is a chance that you can kind of, since it's installed on your device, you can look into the code base, kind of hack into it, because you have all access, right? It's on your system. There is no one protecting it like a web server. So can you securely store the client secret when it comes to mobile apps? No. Because there is a chance that you can hack and look at the JavaScript code running behind that app or something, right? If you're a mobile developer, you have ways to do that. You can simulate few things and do that. That's why you cannot use this flow with mobile app, right? Because the whole gist of this flow is that the protection is provided by securely storing the client secret. That flexibility you don't get in a mobile app, right? So this is the second flow then, right? Second problem statement. A user logs into an app on his or her device and clicks on view cases. Let's say it's a mobile app, to get all the cases from Salesforce. Which grant type or flow should be used? It cannot be web server flow, because you cannot securely save the client secret there. So what is the general recommendation is user agent flow, with grant type as implicit. So implicit grant type user agent. So the bottom flow, it basically shows that there is a mobile app installed on your device. The moment user logs in, clicks on view cases button, it sends a request to Salesforce and gets the access token. So what is missing here, guys, in the mobile app? Did you see the difference here? Here, directly the access token is being returned. There is no authorization code in user agent flow. It's missing. Why is it missing? When I asked you last time, I asked you that why the authorization code is being passed in the web server flow and then access token. When it comes to the mobile world, directly an access token is provided. Why there is no security issue here? Anyone?
As well as we can save one API call.
Okay, API call saving. Okay, but what was the first point you mentioned? What is that? Enlighten me. Huh? Man in middle attack. Okay, all right. So yeah, but that's fine. Man in middle attack is not there. That's the major thing, right? Because see, in the previous one, if you see here, this one, sorry, can I go back? Yeah. So there was a user browser where the user was, working, and then you have a web server, right? So here, browser, web server. But if you see here, the user is itself using mobile app. There is no web server in between. So user is directly requesting the access token and access token is returned. There is no concept of, man in middle attack, of course, is not possible because of that. But then there is a security loophole now, which I'm going to talk about. But yeah, this flow is pretty simple, guys. Direct access token request to Salesforce from the mobile app or a mobile app browser. Same authentication and authorization will happen for the, at least this authorization will happen for one time, because you need to provide authorized access to Salesforce, all the scopes. And then you get an access token response. Now, this access token, how this is returned? it is returned in the browser as well, guys. It's returned in the browser. So even though there is not much scope of man-in-middle attack because there is no web server in between, but what is the other security loophole if the access token is in the browser URL? Can you think of any? You know, it's on your mobile browser, it's your device, no one else is looking into that. CS. No, you're thinking too loud, but
that can be possible.
That
I'm in a mobile browser.
How?
But see, custom. In which context, like?
So you have an access token on the browser, right? It's a mobile browser, no man-in-middle attack. But why? What is the security loophole here? Because there is a security loophole, and this flow is not anymore recommended by the organization which takes care of Auth 2.0 protocol. And we are going to talk about how to fix this problem. But there is a problem, and let me, in interest of time, move forward. So the problem is that you would have enabled the browser history on your mobile. Now, browser history, there is a chance that your access token is stored in your browser history, and then you sync your that history within another mobile device. Somehow you logged into another device, your mobile history is synced there, so your access token also goes to another device which is not even authorized to access Salesforce using the access token. So having access token still has a problem in the browser, even for the user agent flow. Second problem is that since the access token is in the browser, there could be a chance that from that browser, you can redirect and go to any other website, let's say www.facebook.com, and still pass on that access token. So how the redirect happens, right? I'm saying redirect. So let's say, somehow from the browser, you redirect it to Facebook, all the URL parameters will go with the redirect. So Facebook will get your access token of Salesforce. So there is a chance, right? So that problem can be fixed by using something called hash fragment. So what Salesforce does is it will put a hash token or a hash symbol in front of the access token in the browser. With that, even if you redirect to any other browser, anything after hash is not passed on as part of the redirect. So that problem can be fixed. But the device sync history thing cannot be fixed. And that's why Salesforce is not Salesforce, but the organization which maintains this standard, Auth, they're not recommending it anymore. So let's look at this problem statement, right? Which is the other flavor. Same problem statement, but like I said, there are concerns regarding this underlying part. There are concerns regarding the security since the access token can be stored in mobile browser. So what is the solution? And I believe someone asked this question. I think you were, or someone was asking, how can we, when Lilith was presenting or during the Q&A, right? So, and Lilith said there is a hybrid flow or there is another flavor. So this is the flavor, guys, to secure the user agent, which is called Auth 2.0 authorization code with PKCE. So we will talk about what is PKCE, but there is another flavor of the authorization code flow which fixes the user agent problem. Okay, so let's look at that very quickly, right? So now it's the same flow, user agent, but what is happening is now we are going to use the web server flow flavor on the mobile app. So what was the challenge? Why we couldn't use web server flow on the mobile app?
Because we are not actually using a browser.
No. The secret. It cannot store the secret, right? So that problem is still going to be there. That you cannot pass the secret, in the access token request because it's a mobile app. So it cannot say store the secret securely. But then the question is that, okay, the first part is very similar to the authorization code, right? From the mobile browser, an authorization code request goes to Salesforce. Same authentication authorization happens. User logs in, allows the access, and a redirect happens with the authorization code. Till this point, everything is same as the web server flow. But now the problem was that in the access token request, client secret could not be passed. And in web server flow, client secret could be passed. And that was the differentiator, why that flow was very secure. But here we cannot pass it. So how can we ensure that the authorization code there was no man in middle attack and this access token request is genuine? Because client secret is not there in the request. So what happens is there is another concept called code verifier and code challenge. These are two parameters, in the authorization request, optional parameter, but we are using them here. So what happens is, see here on the very left, there is something is written: generate and store a code verifier and a code challenge. So think of it. Let's say we created a 4-digit code, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so the mobile app will create a 4-digit random code and create a hash of it. Okay, so let's say base 64, just create a hash of it with different algorithms, and then sends that hash in the authorization request to authorization server. So here, if you see a code challenge, basically, which is the hash, so of 1, 2, 3, 4 is sent to the authorization server. Salesforce will store that on the Salesforce side, that okay, this particular device has sent me this code challenge, and I am going to store it. Then the authorization, the same flow will happen, authorization code will come back. Now, next time, what the mobile app is going to do, it is going to again hash 1, 2, 3, 4. Again, generate the same hash, which it previously sent as code challenge, and is going to send as part of the access token request. Now, Salesforce is going to compare both the hash, that what was sent in the initial authorization code request as code challenge and what is sent as code verifier hash, and it is going to compare the value. If the values are same, that means no one has tampered with the authorization code. It's the same entity which has initially requested the authorization code is now again asking me the access token request, and then the trust can be established. So this is called proof key of code for code exchange. And now this is the recommended flow for mobile apps, guys. So don't just recommend user agent flow. That's because everyone is saying that things are changing. Okay, so we need to evolve. Good, we are good so far. All right, let's move on to the scenario number 4.
Just one question: how do we generate the code verifier and the code challenge?
Yes, good question. Let me go back. All right, so the question was how to generate the, can you repeat please?
A code verifier and the code challenge.
Yeah, so this can be generated. So if you look at this flow, right, on the mobile app side, there has to be logic in the JavaScript or somewhere, right? Like what is the backend code of the mobile app? It will generate a random code. So what it will do, it will generate a code verifier, which can be a random digit, let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and it can keep on changing. And then for code challenge, what it will do, it will apply a hash algorithm and generate a hash of that. And then in the authorization code, it is just going to pass only the code challenge, not the verifier. Okay. And then Salesforce is going to store that hash of the code verifier, which is the code challenge, on their side. Then, since the mobile app and Salesforce has agreed on the hashing algorithm, when it comes to sending the access token request, then the mobile app is going to use the same algorithm which is used in the very first step to generate the code challenge to hash the code verifier as well. And then that verifier is sent. And then there is no way anyone in the middle can guess what is the hash value of the code verifier, right? So that's how it has happened. But this generation and hashing happens on the client side, on the mobile side.
I have another question.
Yeah.
Why don't we use this on the web as well if it's okay?
You can use that, but you can very well use that. There is no issue. And in fact, if you look at the web server flow, these are optional parameters: code challenge and code verifier. So sometimes the client, if you are dealing with the financial industry, typically it is recommended to also use this flavor along with that. So you can very well use that. But there you are still covered, because even if you don't use it, you have a client secret to protect your access token request. But for mobile apps, you don't have that flexibility because you cannot safely store that anywhere. All right, moving on. Does that answer your question on whoever asked online?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, sure. Thanks. All right, so let's move on to our next problem statement, guys. I hope you are not tired, but still it's interesting. But let me know if it is too much for you to digest. But I hope it's more. I think more interactive would really help. So the next scenario is that there is an integration middleware. All of you know MuleSoft. You have MuleSoft middleware, and it wants to get the data from Salesforce. Is there any user interaction happening here? No. It's server to server, right? There is no user, right? Like in my picture. So this I created, this is not kind of referred from anywhere. This is my visualization on how this should look like, but there is no user anywhere, right? So it's all server to server. So then what should be the authorization flow which should be used? So in the previous two flow, you know that, right? The user logged into Salesforce, user authorized access himself or herself. But in this case, nothing is happening. It's all server to server. So in this kind of scenario, what should be the flow which you should recommend? It's called JWT. Some people call it Jwt. It's the short form, or JSON Web Token. It's the standard flow which is used typically by applications like MuleSoft, or if you are using ETL, Informatica, to access data from Salesforce, nightly batch jobs, everything, right? So if you're explaining your system landscape in a CTA review board, and if you need to, when you are coming to identity strategy, you need to also tell them that how MuleSoft or any middleware is going to get the data, right? And other things. But this is just the gist of that. Now let's look at the Jwt Bearer Flow, right? It's called Jwt Bearer Flow. So it has a grant type, which I forgot to mention, called Jwt Bearer. So user agent has implicit, and then a web server has auth code, but this is Jwt Bearer. And this you need to basically in the connected app, you need to define some settings, with which Salesforce will know that this application is going to authorize via Jwt flow. Oh yeah. All right. So let's look at the flow. So there is a client, which is MuleSoft, and again, authorization server and resource server are Salesforce. Client will create a JWT token, and it will simply send a access token post request. No browser involved here, guys. Simple HTTP post request via API to the token endpoint of Salesforce. And what it sends is grant type, which is Jwt Bearer. That's how Salesforce will know and match it with the connected app settings. And a signed JWT token. We are going to look at what is signed JWT token, but it just sends it. Salesforce is going to validate the JWT signature. We are going to talk about that in a while. It is going to validate the JWT, verify the user access to app. We'll talk about that. And it is going to send an access token response. Very simple flow, or if you look at a very high level. But if you deep dive, what is happening in the background? How do you create a JWT? Basically, MuleSoft needs to have a logic, a code on its side to create a JWT. And this is how a JWT looks, guys. There is going to be a header, which is going to define the algorithm. What is an algorithm? JWT is typically signed with the certificate. And which algorithm is used to sign the JWT, that is defined in the header. Okay. And I'll tell you why this needs to be passed in the header, but in a while. Then there is a claim set. So there are 4 claims which you need to be aware about. There are many more. First thing is issuer, ISS. Then the second one is subject, then audience, then expiry. Issuer is the client ID of the connected app. So MuleSoft will have a corresponding connected app created in Salesforce. The client ID of that is the issuer, because Salesforce is kind of going to issue you the access token. So in the JWT claim set, you need to, MuleSoft needs to identify that, this is the client ID you have provided me to Salesforce. Subject is going to be the user, right? MuleSoft typically uses an integration user, right? So the user ID of that user needs to be in the subject. What is audience? Audience is who is going to receive this JWT request. It is login.salesforce.com. It is the authorization server. Expiry is JWT is valid for a certain duration, so you can also define that. So these are the claim set, and then what happens is using a public key certificate, or it can be a self-signed certificate. All these, the JWT, this plus this is kind of base 64 URL encoded and then kind of signed with that certificate and sends, then the request is sent to Salesforce as a token request. What Salesforce will do, Salesforce also on the connected app, you need to upload the same certificate which was used for signing the JWT. And then Salesforce is going to again perform the same operation. So it is going to kind of pull the JWT string out of this request, and it is going to again, validate whether the JWT was signed with the same certificate. If that happens, then the trust is established. So that is why a user interaction is not required here, because the trust is being established with the help of certificate here. The same certificate which is used to sign the JWT is Salesforce has it, and it verifies that. Is that clear? Okay. Another thing is there is no refresh token issued in this case. What is a refresh token? To your question, right, Bhavna, which you asked, that if an access token expires, then what happens, right? Like very first time you got an access token, it was valid for 24 hours, but then it got expired. Shall we perform the same steps again? For example, in the web server flow? No. Typically, web server and user agent, they also provide another token called refresh token. So what those apps will do, those banking apps, when they will get an error when their access token is expired, they will get an error code, 401 code expired or something. And when they do that, they need to have a logic to use the refresh token to get a fresh access token. They don't need to perform the same steps again. But JWT doesn't issue a refresh token. No, so certificate typically is a valid certificate for a long term, but the Salesforce and the client like MuleSoft, they need to have an agreement that, this is the certificate and they are going to use that certificate. If it expires, then they need to the issuer needs to issue a new certificate. Yeah, but typically the certificate validity is very long term.
But if it expires, then integration won't happen.
Yeah. If it expires, then integration won't happen. No, it will not happen. All right.
Security comes from the fact that both parties have the certificate, but nobody else can generate it.
Exactly. So because the certificate has two types of key, we called it asymmetric cryptography, public key and private key. So it is signed with the private key, and then it is verified with the public key. So signed by the client app with the private key, and then Salesforce uses the public key of the certificate to verify it, because it's asymmetric cryptography. So you can sign with the private and then validate it with the public key. And private key is only with the owner, which is MuleSoft. Public key Salesforce has, so Salesforce can trust that it has come from MuleSoft, because no other app could have signed that with private key, because only MuleSoft has its own certificate's private key. Okay.
That access token never expire unless the certificate is expired, or
so so access token, again, you can define the validity of the access token in the connected app. So in that case, in this case, there is no refresh token, right? So once the access token is expired, the only other way is to perform the same steps from the beginning. But if the certificate itself is expired, then there is a problem, because it needs to be configured in the Salesforce and in the JKS on the MuleSoft side. So then you need to kind of update that. Yes. No, it's okay.
You are showing us combination, right? One is flow and one is grant type.
Yeah.
Is it like a forced combination that when this is a flow, this is a grant type? Or can you like...
No. It's one-to-one mapping. One-to-one mapping. So if the grant type is Jwt Bearer, the expectation is this flow. Okay. You cannot deviate from that.
Otherwise, somebody can do blunders.
Yeah, exactly. And then both the parties will not understand each other, right? It's like we are communicating in English because all of us understand English. But for example, if some of the folks don't understand Netherlands and I start talking in Netherlands, then communication will not happen. So there is an implicit agreement that all of this session is going to be in English. So it's very similar, the grant type concept. So Salesforce, it supports Auth protocol. the client party also supports OAuth protocol. When they say the grant type is Jwt Bearer, they need to agree on these steps by default. Yeah.
Is there a refresh token for a refresh token?
Sorry?
I mean,
No. Refresh token is only for an access token, and using a refresh token, you can get a new access token.
Yeah, exactly. But what is there a lifetime for a refresh token?
Yes, there is a lifetime of refresh token, and you can define that in the connected app. You can choose different settings. Like one setting you can choose is that refresh token will never expire.
Okay.
Another one you can use is that if it can be only expired if it is not used for, let's say, X number of days. Or you can also define that forcefully expire it after 10 days. So you can choose different settings there. Okay. All right. So we have a few more slides to go. I don't know how we are doing on the time, kid.
Yeah. You can go for about 15 more minutes.
15 more minutes. Okay, cool. So let's look at the next problem statement. The next problem statement is very similar, same statement, right? You have an integration middleware and it wants to authorize with Salesforce. The only problem is that integration middleware doesn't want to deal with JSON format of sending the request. Most of you know the JSON format, right? Like Java, the JSON, that's why the JWT was, right? So let's say this app wants to interact in the XML format. So then can we use Jwt Flow? Because the whole basis of the Jwt Flow was that you will create a JSON format claim header and claim set, which you will pass in the request as an assertion. So then you need to use XML. So there is another similar flavor, which is called Auth 2.0 SAML Bearer Assertion Flow, and the grant type is SAML to Bearer. It's very similar. You will create the same, the claim sets, but in the XML format. Again, the interaction is server to server. There is no user interaction here. However, the request will be created in SAML, not in the XML, not in the JSON format. And that's why the name is changed to SAML. So that Salesforce understands that, okay, from the grant type, that it needs to process an XML format, the request of assertion, not the JSON format. Simple. So if you look at the flow, it's very similar to the JSON web token. But if you see here, the assertion is a signed SAML assertion. Again, the certificate is used to sign the assertion. Again, the same certificate will be used to validate the signature. Everything is same. The only difference is that in this case, the format is XML. All right, let's move on to the next scenario. The next scenario is, yeah. Yeah, I mean, sometimes it happens that the client app is not, due to many reasons, right? Security. Sometimes they some clients or some applications, the format is XML because they're legacy. Sometimes they feel that XML is more secure in terms of data, even though it's more heavy in terms of XML envelopes, but it's more secure. So sometimes it's a preference because, for example, if you ask me, many payment gateways, for example, PayPal and all, they still use the SOAP format with XMLs, not the rest, because it's not lightweight, but they, due to the WS security, web security in the XML SOAP, it's more secure, right? So it's all about that. Some preferences on the security side, the type of application, if it is legacy and it was already working in XML, so they don't want to switch to JSON. So different. So it's about the preference there. And sometimes it's like this as well, right? So if we club this with SAML, so let's say there was an IDP, so that application was interacting with an Active Directory and getting already processing the XML in the SAML format. So they are used to doing that. So now they want to authorize with Salesforce after the AD thing happened. So they would like to continue in the same format and do that. Why to switch to JSON, right? So they some of those preferences, but I don't see a very strong reason why this should not be used in the other one. But it's about the data processing and the preferences. All right, so the next one, right? So next one, where are we? So a user logs in to the mobile app. The user was using the Salesforce mobile app to view the cases details. But suddenly one day it is not working. And that is the question which Bhavna asked. What happened? What the hell happened? From the last 10 days, the user was able to access the data, but suddenly it's not working. Why? Because the access token got expired. Its validity was only for 10 days. So now user has to again obtain an access token. How the access token is obtained? Using refresh token, right? So refresh token is always issued as part of the user agent and web server flow, not with JWT. So for those flows, in this case, for instance, it will be the user agent flow because it's a mobile app. So the access token expired, and then this mobile app, the moment there is invalid session ID error. So there is a specific error code and error message which is returned by Salesforce when the access token, expired access token, is used in the request. And then this mobile app has to implement a logic that if this error is returned, switch to the refresh token flow and get a new access token, and then store it securely for authorizing the next request. So if you see here, client is mobile app, authorization server, resource server is Salesforce. There is an access token. So basically a request is sent to the access token endpoint, HTTP post directly, including the refresh token. And again, the client ID and the secret, which was part of the web server flow. And then an access token response is given. And again, then the access token will be valid for next 24 hours, 48 hours, depending upon the connected app policy. Simple. Let's move on to the next scenario. Which authorization flow should I use in this case? So now things are heating up a little bit. We are deep diving into more specialized flows. So this one is another special flavor of the authorization flow. It says a user installs an app on his or her smart TV. Most of us have smart TV at home, right? So we install various apps, right? Netflix and different things, different types of apps to see, watch shows, series. So user installs that, but in this case, the user wants the app to switch off the house lights while the user is away, having drinks at a bar in evening, and he forgot to switch off the lights while leaving from house. So now he wants the app basically, but in this case, the user cannot be outside because it's a smart TV. If it is a mobile, then the user could be outside. But let's say I am watching smart TV and I don't want to get up from my chair and switch off the light. So what I want to do is on my smart TV itself, I want to access an app, and that access as a button, switch off the light. And if I press that, the lights of the other two bedrooms should be switched off. Okay, how can we do that? When Salesforce is protecting or carrying some of the user data. For example, in this case, any app, if it has to switch off the light, what information the app needs to know? Bare minimum, the app needs to know what is the location, where the lights are installed, which needs to be switched off, which user is requesting that, right? Like location plus at least the user information. Let's say the location information is stored in Salesforce. So how this authorization will work? Think about it, right? So again, user accesses the app. If you look at the bottom flow, app is installed on the user smart TV. The data, location data, and the user data is stored on the Salesforce side. So what the app wants to do, app wants to access Salesforce on user's behalf and get the location information. Once the location information is returned to the app, then app can use that location using Alexa or something and can switch off the light of the two bedrooms, right? So the point here is that here it's another advanced version of an auth flow called device flow. So there is a grant type called device for that. And let's deep dive into that because it's a little bit more involved. So let's look at this, right? So you have a device, which is a TV or an app on that. You have a user information, location, preferences, everything is stored on the Salesforce side. So basically the device needs to obtain that information from Salesforce in an authorized way. But how can device access Salesforce? So what device will do, the moment user will click on the app, the device will send an authorization request to Salesforce, which is the authorization server. And it says, This is the client ID. The response type is device code. This is the scope. Give me the response of the authorization. What the authorization server, which is Salesforce, will issue is 2-3 things, right? And you can correlate it to your own experience as well. Have you installed any app on the TV and have you received a 4-digit code? And there is a URL which says, okay, go to that URL, enter that code, and then you are authorized? Yes. So that is a device authorization happening, a very similar flavor. But in this case, that authorization server is not Salesforce, but some other application, that application's backend. But in this case, it's replaced by Salesforce. Very similar. So here, in the authorization response, what you will get? 2 codes. One is the user code, one is the device code, and then the verification URL. Okay. So now user can actually see on the TV that code displayed, right? The user code. And on the TV, there will be an instruction which says, please go to this URL on your mobile device or the laptop and enter this code. That is the user code, and that verification URL is the URL which the user needs to navigate. User will do that. User navigates to the URL, enters the user code. The moment the user will enter the user code, then user will have to authenticate to Salesforce and approves that authentication will be done. Okay. And then the device can use its own code, which was the other code, device code, to get the access token from Salesforce. Now you can very well ask that, oh, no, what if the user doesn't enter the code and doesn't go to the verification URL, how the device will know? There is no way device can know. So that's why a minimum polling interval is also issued to the device. What is minimum polling interval? That on what frequency this device can keep on sending this access token request. So for example, initially the code was returned, the verification URL was returned, and the minimum polling interval was 5 minutes. Now the user has 5 minutes to open the verification URL and enter the code. What if the user was busy, or user got into a phone call and user was not able to enter the code? After 5 minutes, the device will send the access token request. Then Salesforce will still come back and tell them that user has still not authenticated. So poll after next 5 minutes. Then the device will send the request after next 5 minutes. Maybe in the next 5 minutes, user was able to conclude the phone call. So
you will not generate another code?
Sorry?
No,
because the request, there is already a code which is device code in the request. So Salesforce will know that Salesforce has already issued the device code in the very first step. So Salesforce will not let that.
Authentication between the user and the server. What kind of authentication there? It's the user web server.
Yeah, it's basically the very similar flavor to web server. User enters the code, and then Salesforce will say, okay, log in with your credentials, approve the access to the scope and everything. So it's very similar to one. And no, that is an MFA flavor, multi-factor authentication. That's for again, double checking the authentication so that your password is not compromised. So there is another factor of authentication. This is a flavor where you are authorizing your smart TV app to get the information from your Salesforce system. So earlier we were talking about web app. We were talking about mobile app, right? But here we are talking about a flavor where there is a device with limited display capabilities, and it wants to do something smart, but it wants to authorize with Salesforce on a user's behalf to get the data first, right? Like, for example, this mobile app on the TV can have an integration with Alexa to control the mobile lights control or something. But first it wants to know what is the location of the user, what is the preference? Is it 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom? And that data is stored in Salesforce. Now, this app has to get that data from the Salesforce, but before that, the app has to authorize with Salesforce. So this authorization flow enables that.
How does it different than the mobile app? Because we can do the same concept, end of the day, it's object and data, right?
Yeah.
So mobile is also a device, and mobile app is also app. Here also we are talking about device and app.
Yeah.
So how do we differentiate that this
flow we should use for this device versus this mobile we should use for mobile?
Yeah, good question. Good question. So mobile app is a very standard flow, right? Where you have a mobile app, it needs to access your data. Simple, right? But in this case, what we are saying is that there is a device with a limited capability, display capability. It has a screen like a mobile device or a smart TV app, and it wants to integrate with Salesforce on a user's behalf, right? Like to control few things. So it's not like the device is returning the records from Salesforce, right? It is just being authorized to get certain preferences of the user, and then it uses that preferences to do something smart. It is more of an IoT flavor if you look at it. So there is a difference. So mobile app is very simple. There is an app. You need to authorize with Salesforce and get the data, right? And there is a user authentication where a user needs to log in into login.salesforce.com, authorize the app and get the data. But here, the flavor is that device wants to authorize and Salesforce will say, okay, there is a user code and a verification URL. Go to that URL first, enter the code. If you enter that, then I will trust you. And then this device can access and get the token. If you don't do that, then the device is not going to be authorized, right? So it is like there is a smart device, then there is an app, and then you are authorizing that app on a specific instance, right? And to get the access token. While the mobile app is where, it's just like you authorize that mobile app and it keeps on getting the data. There is no user code or verification URL involved there.
But if you would like to use it in the mobile,
yeah.
So that device, we can. Right?
You can use that.
So
the similar thing.
Code and then go to the
yeah. So like yeah, exactly. It's just user experience. I actually in the bookshelf, the example is of mobile app. I changed the flavor to smart TV, right? Because I wanted to share another view of this one. Because in the Salesforce help documentation, the flow is explained that there is a mobile app and you are outside sitting in a bar and since you are outside, you want to switch off your house lights. Now, how will you do that? So you will open a mobile app on your device and you will click a button, switch off the lights. Now, how that mobile app sends a signal to your house devices, that is that flavor. This flavor is that there is a similar app, but it integrates with Alexa to switch off the light. So the point here, Manmohan, is that here this device has IoT capabilities. The user agent flow, if you look at it, it's a plain mobile app without any IoT flavor there, right? So where a mobile app integrates with Salesforce, gets the data. This one here, you're interacting with the device, which is more like an IoT device, and you are authorizing that device to access some of your devices, your smart devices like your smart lights, your Alexa. And this device and the flavor there is that you need to provide an additional level of verification there, where a user needs to go to a verification URL and enter a user code, so that Salesforce trusts that this action can be taken by that app. So it's a little bit more involved than your regular mobile app flow. Getting it? Yeah. All right. Let's move on to another scenario, guys.
Unrelated to the question,
yeah.
It's almost going to be nice.
Yeah. I have one more flow to cover, the last flow, asset token flow, and then we can wrap up. But it's again a very involved flow, so it depends upon the questions, how many questions people will ask.
I hope everybody is okay, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
You have to leave 9:30.
Okay. And how much time we have?
We have an hour from now.
Okay. Yeah. I will try to wrap up in 5 minutes or 10 minutes max, if depending on the questions. I hope that's okay. Yes. All right.
We cannot ask questions.
No, it's okay. So let's look at the next one, right? It's another involved scenario. A user purchases a new smart fridge, okay, and wants to register that device with Salesforce. So all of us, we buy ACs, smart fridges and other stuff, right? And how do you register your devices for warranty, guys? So let's say you have purchased a new TV, new smart fridge, and you want to register that device with the company. Let's say it was an LG refrigerator or fridge, and you want to register that device for guarantee or warranty for next 2 years, right? You need to register at with their support. How do you do that? Any views? Go to the site and register that, right? So, but what if I ask you that you need to register it at Salesforce with Salesforce, but you don't want to, you can only register it. So you purchased a smart fridge from LG, and LG says that, oh, the user after purchasing, user needs to go to Play Store and App Store, download a LG mobile app, and there enter the information, and that will ensure that your device is registered in the backend, and the backend is Salesforce. Right now, what you need to do, what the mobile app needs to do, mobile app needs to, again, this is another flavor. User is not directly integrating with Salesforce. User doesn't even know Salesforce exists in the background. User has purchased a smart TV, smart fridge, and user wants to register it with Salesforce, right? Using a mobile app for guarantee support or something. Another flavor to this, it's not about registration, but since it's a smart fridge, also the requirement is that after the smart fridge is installed at user's location, that smart fridge should send regular status signals to Salesforce or the backend of the Salesforce. Because if the smart fridge is not operating correctly, maybe it's heating up too much, the temperature is going up more than a certain threshold, then there is a problem, and a case needs to be created in Salesforce so that someone can be dispatched to the customer house to fix the smart fridge. Another IoT use case, no user direct interaction with Salesforce, but you want to do so many things, right? Like look at this flow. User downloads the mobile app after purchasing. So here you have a fridge right at the bottom. You know, I've tried to find an icon, you know, which is more IoT specific, but yeah. So user downloads the mobile app and user registers the fridge with the try to register that on the mobile app. Mobile app sends a request to Salesforce to register the device in Salesforce. What will happen in the background in Salesforce if a device is registered? What record will be created, guys? Asset, right? So because it's a sold asset to the customer. So this registration, what it should do, it should dynamically create an asset record in Salesforce. Number one, once the asset record is created and it is linked to the user account, right, in Salesforce. Second thing is, now this device is registered. Now this device wants to send IoT signals directly for monitoring to a backend app. Now tell me, can you send IoT's data directly to Salesforce, or should you send that? Like millions of records? No. Salesforce is not meant for that, right? So what Salesforce will do typically, if it is Salesforce, it will use a system like Heroku, a PaaS, right, to process those millions of IoT signals from various devices and write the monitoring logic there, which checks, okay, if the status is fine, I'm not going to do anything. But what if one of the devices is sending an abnormal signal? Then this app should create a case in Salesforce. Now this all needs to happen as part of the authorization. What will enable that? Asset token flow. So this is the most advanced version, I believe, of the IoT scenarios for authorization, but it's not usually tested in the review board, but there are few flavors. I should not disclose much, but there are flavors where this can be tested. So, but it's just not for review board, guys. It's just for common understanding. We are now living in the era of IoT, right? So we need to know how Salesforce supports that, right? So Auth asset token flow, grant type is token exchange. Now let's look at the flow. Okay, so you have a device, right? It's smart fridge. It's on the left side. It is not doing anything. Then you have client. What is a client? The mobile app, which you downloaded from the app store, like LG mobile app for LG refrigerator. So what this will do is the user will try to log in into the mobile app. So user logs in into the mobile app, and then user will go to the LG registration page, enters that model number of the fridge and all other things, and clicks on register, right? What this mobile app will do, mobile app will send the request to Salesforce to authorize with Salesforce. And in the first step, authorization can happen using any flow. Can be web server flow, can be user agent flow. Since it's a mobile app, let's say it's a user agent flow. What Salesforce will do, so when a user agent flow runs, what happens what is the outcome of that? An access token is returned. So this client app will get an access token first. Now the client app is authorized on user's behalf with Salesforce. So user is not directly accessing Salesforce, has got the access token. Now you need to register the device data, right? Like I said, we need to create an account, asset record, link it to the account. So for that, what client app needs is something called actor token. So here we are introducing a new token called actor token. What is an actor token? Actor token basically is a signed JWT, which includes the information of the device. So what it says is, this is the model number of the device. This is the name of the device. This was the sale date of the device. This is purchased by this customer, all the device information. Okay, so that actor token needs to be created. Then in the second step, what Salesforce will do is, Salesforce will send a request to register the device metadata, the device data, using the access token obtained in the first step and the access token. So basically access token and actor token, both the tokens are sent to register the device. And in the result of that is Salesforce will again issue a special token called asset token. So that is the asset token, right? So this is the token which is the outcome of this flow. So now I've introduced many tokens, right? So in the first step, there was an access token. Actor token is created in the backend on the client side, right? Salesforce doesn't have to do anything, but if you pass the actor token, which you need to pass, Salesforce will create an asset record here, right? Salesforce will create an asset record and it will also link it to the account because all that information is going to be in the actor token. And then in the end, it is going to issue an asset token. Now, what is the advantage of asset token, right? Because if the asset token is returned, then this device, the smart fridge, can use that asset token to authorize with Heroku app. And we are going to see how it works, but this is the basic nitty-gritty.
We are talking here about two different connected apps, right?
No, only one.
The same connected app.
Same connected app.
For authentication.
Yeah.
And also for the access token.
Yes, same. Because the grant type tells, and in the connected app, you need to define the configuration for your asset token, like for how longer it will be valid. For example, asset token can be a very long-lived token. It can go up to 7, you can, I think the duration can be pretty high, there. I think it can be there for 1 year as well. You can make it valid for 1 year, 720 days or something.
Okay.
Okay. Half an hour?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay, so let's look at this asset token, right? Like, let's demystify the actor token, right? So we talked about actor token. So actor token has this information, guys, right? So it has the account ID. This is the Salesforce account ID. This is the customer account ID, right? Serial number of the device, the name of the asset, and some device key, which I'll not deep dive into because it will be too much in this session. But so this just gives the data to create the asset record in Salesforce. This is the actor token. Now you have asset token, right? So this is the asset token returned by Salesforce, right? So it has lots of data like what is the URL, for example, what is the URL of that backend device, Heroku app, which is going to receive the IoT monitoring signals. That is the audience. Then, yeah. Which account ID that needs to be passed as part of the actor token. So that, because the customer basically that information needs to be there in the actor token metadata, that if there is an existing account, then that asset record will be created and it will be linked to that account. So either an account or a contact ID can be passed in that actor token. Okay. So now in the asset token, you get the subject, audience, there is something called key and other things, right? So basically what you guys need to understand is asset token is eventually used by the fridge, the smart device, to regularly communicate its status as part of the status signals with Heroku app. Okay. And this is how, like, I have done, I did the parsing and, you know, of that, and I'm just trying to explain you how, you know, this, what is the composition of that. So, all right, let me see where we are. Okay, so now my question, how Heroku app will know that authorize this device, right? Like, so far, if you look at this, like a food for thought, so far, all the communication has happened with Salesforce, right? So initially you got an access token from Salesforce, then you registered your actor token, got an asset token, device got the asset token. But Heroku app was nowhere in the middle. So now if the device will start sending the API request to Heroku app using the asset token, how Heroku app will know that this is a valid request and this device is registered with Salesforce and all other things? Any guesses? Yeah. So in the asset token, one thing which will be returned is the audience, and that audience should be the URL of this particular device backend. Number two, there is going to be a key ID. And that key is going to be the org. Every org has a specific key. There are a bunch of keys which are identity keys which the organization supports. You know, I'll not deep dive into it. It's a more involved topic, but it's also passed. So for Heroku, it's once the audience is those claims which are included in the asset token, they provide the information that, okay, this is this device. It has this key ID, this is the audience, and I can trust it. And what Heroku app will do, it will return an access token again to this device. And then this device can start sending the, regularly start passing on the information to Salesforce. Okay. And then Heroku and Salesforce can have another set of authorization where if the, you know, the device temperature was too high, Heroku can create a case in Salesforce. And how it will know, you know, for creating a case, you need to link it to an account, right? Customer. So that information will be retrieved from the asset as well, right? Because there is an asset ID. So it will know, okay, this is the parent account of the asset. Now let's create a case with this asset. Let's dispatch a field service agent to fix the device at the customer location. Yeah. All right. All right, so I think that's all I wanted to cover. I know it was too much. Yeah, I think these are the flows. You can refer to it, but these are the flows. So far, we have talked about inbound authorization. This is the outbound authorization. So if Salesforce acts as a client and the server is outside. So right now we were talking about if there was an external application which is authorizing with Salesforce. If the roles are reversed, if Salesforce is a client and there's a other application which supports OAuth protocol, what can you do? So these are the flows or the mechanisms which you can configure at the named credential level, right? Because for every outbound integration, you need to use named credential. And there you can use Auth 2.0 web server flow, Jwt token exchange. Now token exchange is another concept which we can deep dive. You can Google about it or reach out to me. You know, we can discuss. Last part is layered flow. I think Lilith has already covered that. So it's just for your reference, another flavor of web server and SAML layering and how this works. It's important to know, at least if you're preparing for CTA, definitely it's important. With that, I will talk about some references. Same reference, cloudsundial.com. Lilith has already shared that. You can check that out, and Salesforce